Probably the single hardest thing for me to really wrap my head around when it came to Capture One was the adjustment brush settings. They're just so confusing. So stick around because I'm going to walk you through it step by step so that you will be a master at adjusting. All right, for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to use a black picture. That way it's going to be easier for us to see the mask as it's applied and the different degrees of the mask. All right, so let's start off with the simplest setting. First, we're going to set everything to 100%. And we're going to start off with the simplest setting, which is size. This one I think everybody can figure out, right? The bigger the size number is, the bigger your brush is. So that's pretty simple, right? So there's size. You got that. All right, now let's go to hardness. This is hardness 100%. Now when I click, it's going to put 100% hardness, and I'm at 100% opacity, 100% flow. So it's going to be a full 100% mask, completely filling up this circle. Oh, let me turn on the M. There you go. That's a 100% mask at a hard brush. Now watch what happens when I change the hardness. I'm going to go right here and I'm going to turn the hardness down to 50% or so. Now you'll notice the inner circle is still the same size that it was before. But now there's this bigger outer circle. So the hardness is now at 50%. And what that means is instead of it being a hard line where it completely fills in the mask right here like you have on the left, it's going to feather the mask from the inner circle to the outer circle. So now when I click, it does that. And you can see the feathering starts inside the inner circle and then actually extends a little bit outside of the outer circle. So the more you make your hardness a small number, you can see that outer circle gets bigger and bigger. So now we're at 3 hardness. And when I click now, take that away, you can see the hardness, it goes a little bit further outside the circle each time. See how it just barely seems, you can barely see it outside the circle, and here it's further outside the circle. Your entire range is encompassed by the large circle. This is counterintuitive because I would think that when you change the hardness, it would change the way that the feather occurs inside the brush circle, but it doesn't. It actually goes outside the brush circle. So you have to remember that when you change your hardness, you are in effect changing the size of the actual brush. So like here's this 3%. Now if I put 3% hardness right here, boom. Now if I do it again, watch what happens. And again, and again. See, it's overlaying it more and more and more. And at the outer edges, where the hardness is the softest part of the brush is at the outer edges, the more you lay on at the outer edges, the more you see it, the more it becomes visible to you. So eventually, if I keep clicking it, it will fill up the entire full circle. See? So that's what hardness does. All right, we okay? This is actually the easy part. All right, so let's go back to a hardness of 100. There you go. And now let's talk about opacity. Opacity 100, very simple. You click the button, you get a 100% opacity mask, meaning any changes that you make to this layer are going to be 100% applied. There, 100%. It's a clear piece of glass. Everything is going through. So this is a 100% opacity mask. Now, if I change this opacity to 50%, now it's going to put a 50% opacity mask. So now, any changes you make to this part of the image, only 50% of those changes will actually occur. Here, all of the changes will occur. So if I was to put a one-stop exposure gain, like I was to increase my brightness by 1 stop, this part would actually go up by 1 stop, but this part would only go up by 50% of a stop. It would only go up by half a stop because this part has a 50% opacity. Right? Makes perfect sense, right? You understand that. Now here's the tricky part. When you click, and apply this opacity, as long as you never let go of the button, it will apply 50% opacity to every place where there is no mask. This is important. So if I click and move it around, you can see it's going to apply 50% opacity, and that's it. But if I click my 50% opacity on a spot where there already is some opacity, it'll apply it again. So watch this. Now what's happened here? This is a 50% mask, and this is a 50% mask. And here they have overlapped. So do we get a 100% mask right here? No, we don't. No, we don't. This is where it starts to make your mind explode. When you are applying an opacity, it is applying that opacity to whatever remains. All right, you understand what I'm saying? So if you take a 50% and apply it and it touches another 50%, then this is a 50% opacity. And where they touch, this is a 50% opacity of the 50% opacity. So let me change this to a different number to make it easier to understand. We'll change it to say 20%. So this is 20% opacity. Let me make a new mask so it's easier to see. This is 20% opacity. This is also 20% opacity to the right. Where they touch in the middle, it's 20% opacity, which means there's 80% that's not opaque. I just applied a 20% opacity to the 80% that's not opaque. So I applied 16% more opacity. So this was a 20% opacity. I added 16% more. So now this is a 36% opacity. Now I'm going to do it right here. What happened? This was a 36% opacity. That means that there was 64% opacity that was not opaque. I took 20% of that and added it to get whatever the hell that number is going to be. So what it means is that as you are applying it on top of itself, 20%, that's not 40, it's 20% plus 20% of 80. Then another 20%, which is going to be 20% of whatever was left. And another 20%, which is 20% of whatever was left. So theoretically, you can do this all day and you will never, ever, ever actually get a 100% mask. Because whatever's left, you're only going to take 20%. You're only going to put 20% opacity on whatever's left. So that's an infinitely small number. Eventually, you'll have a 0.000000001% that's not opaque. You know, because you'll always be taking just 20% of what's left, 20%. You'll never take it all. So it'll always never, ever, ever be quite opaque, but it'll be damn close. I mean, if you do it all day, now I'm multiple clicking here, that's pretty close to a full mask, right? That's close enough for sure for what you're doing. But this is, like I said, it's important to understand that a 50% opacity applied on top of another 50% opacity does not give you 100% opacity. It technically would give you 75%. So let's try that. I'm curious. Let's do a 75% opacity. This is 75 right here. And now let's do a 50 twice. So this is a 50, and then we do it again. Yeah. See, those, they look pretty close, right? This is a 75% opacity, and this is a 50% opacity, and then I did another 50% of what was left, and 50% of what was left was 25%. So 50% opacity and 25% opacity, 75% opacity. So basically, that's the same opacity. This is my understanding, by the way, of how this works. I haven't talked to anyone at Capture One. But mathing it out myself, this is how I believe it works. So that's opacity. Now we're going to throw another monkey wrench into it. And we're going to talk about flow. With opacity, if you click on the page, this is 50% opacity. And then if I click and move around, it never applies more than 50%. What it does is it only applies 50% opacity to the areas of the picture that are not already at 50% opacity. Understand? If I click and apply 50% opacity, and then I click again inside that, it does it again. to the area that's remaining. And then again, so forth. However, flow is constant. So if I take my opacity to 100% and my flow to 50%, now what's going to happen is I have 100% opacity on my mask, but when I click, it's only going to apply 50% of it, which is pretty much the same as before. You can apply 50% opacity, or you can flow 50% opacity. That's 100. Either way, it's 50% in the end, right? So, bam, that's a 50% opacity. And if I change this to flow of 100 and opacity is to 50, I get the same thing. Bam. Both of them are going to be 50%. But here's the difference. Remember I showed you that when you are at 50% opacity, you never get more than 50% opacity as long as you don't let go of the button, right? You click your mouse and you move it around and you get 50% opacity. And you're just really just wiping off anything that's not 50% until the whole thing is at 50%, right? That makes sense? Now, if you do it with flow, where you take your opacity 100 and your flow to 50, now you're also going to be getting 50% opacity. The difference is, as long as the button is pressed, it's going to continue to lay that 50% down every time you move the mouse. So, 50% flow on a 100% opacity, but the minute I move the mouse, as long as I keep the button pressed, the minute I move the mouse, it's going to overlay it again. Bam. And when I move it again, it's going to overlay it again. Bam. So watch. It's just continually putting that 50% mask down. In order to do this with the opacity, if I had the flow at 100% and the opacity at 50, I would have to go click, 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 click. I'd have to constantly be clicking. But with the flow at 50% and the opacity at 100, I can just draw by just moving my mouse. Hold the mouse down and move my mouth. That's what flow does for you. Now, let's put them together. Let's take our hardness and adjust it down to 50% as well. So now we're going to flow 100% opacity, but only at 50% speed as long as we move the mouse, and it's going to be softer. So I'm going to click, and then I'm going to move. See how that flows? How nice that is? But I can go back over the same spot, and it's going to continue to apply it. See? Continuing to apply it. More and more and more. So I can just paint, basically, onto the screen. Which gives us one last setting to look at, and that is Airbrush. There's also pen pressure if you're using a pen, but we're not going to cover that today. And that's Airbrush. So what does Airbrush do for us? So let's go back to 100% on everything. Airbrush, it's kind of like flow, I guess, in a way. Airbrush, with flow, it applies it to the canvas as long as you move the mouse, right? With Airbrush, it applies it to the canvas as long as the button is pushed. Doesn't matter if you move the mouse or not. So if I've got flow at 50%, at 100%, or let's take flow to 50, let's go take flow to say 20%. So now when I click, it puts a 20% mask on, and that's it. And then if I move it, it does it again. And if I continue to move it, it continues to put it on, and you can see it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. But if I click on Airbrush, now from the minute I click the button, as long as I'm holding it, it's going to continue to apply the mask. So I click and hold, and it just pours it onto the canvas. So that, if you looks like this. And so you can see it's applying it much faster. But you can make it apply it slower. All you have to do is change your flow to a really slow flow, like a flow of 2, and now it's much slower. Which brings us to, how do I actually use these settings? All right, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I don't use Airbrush. And here's why. The problem for me with Airbrush is that you have to constantly be in motion with your cursor, because if you just pause for a second, you're like painting with some, I'll show you, like you're painting and then you get distracted and you go, what? And you look over to the, oh, I'm sorry. And while you're sitting there, now suddenly it's just pouring paint onto the canvas. You get a fire hose of paint and you can't turn it off. You know, you can by unclicking, but I mean, you can unclick and click and unclick and click and unclick and click, right? Anytime you want to think for a second. But anytime you just for a second you want to pause, for a microsecond you want to pause, you got to remember to unclick. So you're constantly clicking, spraying, clicking. So it's good, I think, if you want to like sweep. If you want to be like, I want to sweep some there, sweep some there, sweep some there, sweep some there. But for me, no. I like Airbrush to be off, and that way I can hesitate and think, and the paint stops pouring while I do that. So here's what I like to do. I like to use a very low flow, about 2, and an opacity of 100, so I can get full mask if I want it, and then hardness down around, say, 47, 50, somewhere in there. So this is what I like to have right here. So when I click and drag, it's very subtle what I'm putting down. But if I continue to move it around, you can see that I can lay that mask in nice and subtle wherever I want it to be. Just wiggle. See, just wiggle. Just wiggle it. Wiggle it just a little bit. You just wiggle it right there. Boom, boom, boom. And you can put it anywhere you want it. So how does this look in a practical application? Well, let's do that real quick. So here's a picture. And my model's face is in shadow, right? You see the darkness under her eyes, dark, 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 dark. Now, let's do this like old school first, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is an old school mask. We're going to put the flow at 100, the opacity at 100, and the hardness at 100. And we're going to make a nice small brush. And we're just going to paint in her face like this. And one of the good things about Capture One is you can then just go right here and hit right click, fill mask, and then right click, refine mask. And now you can refine it like this, make it really hard at the edges or make it soft and feathery at the edges. So right about there, that's good. So that's my mask. Now I'll turn off the mask view. I'm going to raise the exposure. And what's going to happen is you can see her face is going to become brighter. So there's way too much. So we come down to right about, say, there. That's probably a pretty decent exposure for her face. Now, her face looks, doesn't look like it's in shadow so much. But here's the thing. It's applying a universal effect, right? Right now I'm at 0.66 exposure gain, and it's going to apply it to her whole face exactly the same. Pretty much. I mean, there's a little softness around the edges when we refine the mask, but otherwise it's all the way across her face. And I want to be a little more artistic. I want to get in there and really work like her eyes are darker, for example, than her forehead is. So I want to bring her eyes up a little bit more, etc., etc., etc. So I enjoy coloring. I enjoy painting. So what I do is we'll start a new mask and we'll change our hardness to about 50%. And we'll change our flow way down to about 3. So that's a really light flow. Now I'm going to take the M, boom. Now we're going to be able to see the mask. And watch what happens now when I paint with my mask. See how it's lightly going on? And I got to tell you, that's actually too much. Okay, that's actually going on harder than I want it to be. So I'm going to go and I'm going to turn my flow down to like 2. There you go. So now I can just paint it in wherever I want it. But here's what's great. I can paint with light now. So I'm going to create a new layer. Here's my settings again. My hardness is at 50%. My opacity is at 100%. My flow is really low at 1. Right? Now I'm going to go over to exposure and I'm going to raise my exposure up to right around +1. Like a full one-stop exposure. And then I'm going to click the mouse button and I'm just going to start to paint the light in. So now I'm just painting it in Well, let me turn the mask off. There you go. So now I'm just painting the light in, right? Just moving around, painting the light. And if I stop moving it, nothing happens because I don't have airbrush on, nothing's happening. So I just continue to paint around her face. I'm adding a general light to her face. And then her eyes, like this eye is really dark, so I'm just going to do a little wiggle it right here and add more light here and more light here and just continue to paint around her face and bring it up just where I want to bring it up. And it is so subtle as I do it that you may not even be noticing it, right? I'm holding my mouse down the whole time. And now I'm done. It's so subtle, you probably didn't notice, but watch what happens when I turn it off. There you go. And that's the original picture, and now I've painted the light in where I want it to be. And if you want to see what the mask looks like, there you go. And you can see I've painted in more mask in her eyes, more mask here, so there you go. And if you get it finally painted in, you go, that's pretty good. You go, I like her whole face. I like everything just be a little brighter or a little less bright. All you have to do is go to exposure and just raise it up a little. So I can raise it up, I can lower it down, do whatever I want it to do, and I've got this very custom mask on her face. So that right there is probably just about right. So there's before, and there's after. I'll do it with this one. Here we go. There you go. There's her face split. Before, after. So again, there's my settings. I like to have my opacity at 100%, so I can get a full 100% mask on the page if I want to, but I'm really going to have to do a lot of brushing to get 100% on the page because my flow is set so incredibly low. Right? Now, let me just give you a little hint. There's another way you can do this. Let's also get rid of this mask again and get rid of this grid. Now, I could also do this. I could say, give me more flow. Let's go with a flow of 5, but only give me an opacity of 50%. And now it's going to be the same thing. Turn up my exposure, and it's going to apply it very light. Because it's applying it more, the flow is higher, but the opacity is lower, but it still has the same effect. And I can just paint. There, paint around there a little bit. And remember, you have to keep your mouse moving. If you just hold it in one spot, nothing happens. I mean, it puts the mask on, but then it doesn't put any more. But as long as you're wiggling it and rotating it, you can bring it up. There you go. And then that's before, after. Before, after. More mask, no, just wiggle it more. Just paint more. Right? And then you really get a feel for what that's like. You get a feel for how much mask you can lay down with, with the wiggling that you do and the brushing that you do. And so basically it's like you're painting with the same brush all the time, and you just become a master at using that brush to get whatever you want to get. All right, that's our brush settings. I hope that this helped. Be sure and leave some comments below. And if you know more about the math of it than I do, because, again, I'm kind of gaming this out, I would love it for you to explain it to me in the comments. If I messed up a little bit someplace on the math, please let me know, because I'm always trying to learn how this stuff works at a deep, deep level. Thanks for watching.